start. Excellent. Okay, now we all sit here and look beautiful as people pile in.
Comes to me naturally. I don't do anything.
I'm here.
Oh, hey, Paula.
Hi. I'm gone now from the phone.
Okay, people are coming in, so we're going to be quiet till we get started. Okay. Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Going Under. So this is an important question as we discuss the results of the health impact assessment that was recently released by Save Jimmy Simpson and the South Riverdale Community Health Center. So I'm Maggie Redmonds. I'm a member of the Save Jimmy Simpson organizing group. And I'll be your moderator of sorts for tonight. So please note that this webinar is being recorded, so people who weren't able to make it tonight will be able to see it at a later date. Next slide, please. We acknowledge that this land was lived on and well cared for by a number of First Nations in the past. Toronto remains home to many Indigenous peoples. By making this acknowledgement, we are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and the Indigenous presence, which dates back over 10,000 years. We are grateful to be able to live, work, and meet here. Next slide. So this evening, we're going to hear details about the content of the recently released health impact assessment of the Ontario line in South Riverdale. SJS was concerned that there was no thorough environmental or health impact studies done before the design was finalized. So we approached South Riverdale Community Health Center to partner with us to see about getting an HIA done. And they were happy to come on board. Sorry for the bad pun. So with some initial funding from their community health fund, we started a GoFundMe page and were able to raise about almost $18,000 to fund and promote the report. So we're extremely grateful to all of those community members who contributed to make this happen. Thank you so much. So just before I introduce the panelists, let me point out that there will be about 20 minutes at the end this evening for Q&A after they speak. So Laura Koo from Save Jimmy Simpson is going to be managing the questions in the Q&A. You can hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to add yours. So now I'm going to introduce you to each of our panelists in order of their presentation. And I'll introduce them all now so they can just carry on when it's their turn. So first, Paula Fletcher, as I'm sure you all know, is the City Councillor for Ward 14, Toronto Danforth. She focuses on creating a healthy city through her involvement in housing, public health, recreation, environment, and community development issues. Paula has been tireless in her work on a number of local issues, including the Ontario line. Mariana Valverde is a recently retired professor at the University of Toronto, a researcher and speaker of international stature, and an author of books on a number of different topics, including her forthcoming one, which is called simply Infrastructure. Ronald Macfarlane, our report's author, has been an advocate for a healthy environment and sustainable development in Africa and Asia, as well as in Canada. He has worked with national and municipal organizations, as well as with advocacy groups, to assist in creating healthy, equitable, and sustainable communities. Those of us who worked with him on this project learned a lot from the process and remain in awe of his skills and his ethical approaches. Eon's song keeps SJS members busy, considering his abundance of energy, ideas, and plans. He also brings us a lot of laughter, which is most appreciated. Tonight, you'll experience the result of some of his astute and diligent work. Paul Young wears a number of hats. He's worked in planning and urban design for 25 years. He's a health promoter at South Riverdale Community Health Center and also a very valued member of Save Jimmy Simpson. Peter Tabuns is no stranger to folks in this area. He has been the MPP for Toronto Danforth since 2006, and he canvasses the riding at least annually. He's the Ontario NDP critic for energy and the climate crisis, and he has been a strong supporter of re-examining plans for the Ontario line. And a quick thanks to Noam Lambden, who is managing our visuals this evening. So Paula, you're on.
Great. Hi, everybody. Just put my headphones in. Good evening, everybody. It says, what track are we on? I think we wake up every day and wonder which track we're on because it's changed just so many times. I just want to give you a little background, and probably a lot of you who are here tonight have that, but I think we all remember that our community spent a long time doing the underground relief line with the TTC and had that, the environmental assessment is called a TPAP, had that approved. And Metrolinks approved that. And then, of course, there was Transit City, which was a TTC plan and a city plan. Metrolinks did approve that, and it's been taken over. It actually got taken over under the previous government. And one of the reasons why, and maybe we don't talk about that too much, one of the reasons why Metrolinks came in to do that and take over these projects, well, they're very, very rich projects. They are worth a lot of money, as we know. And instead of having the regular way that it's done through the TTC, with tendering and having a builder and being managed, there's something called design, build, finance, and maintain, which is how the express out to the airport was built. And in there is a lot of, I just talk about gravy because, as we know, our premier loved to talk about gravy before when he was at city council, but it's full of gravy on all parts. The design, build, finance, the maintain is where the big money is, but there's a lot of cushioning there to make sure whoever has that tender makes a lot of money. And Peter might be able to speak a bit more about that. So we think, why did they take that over? Well, in order to have something where people will make more money than if it was being built by the TTC. The issue, of course, there's an environmental assessment on the original underground relief line. There was a full environmental assessment. Many of you were probably involved in that. It was formal. It's called a transit project assessment process. And it was expedited. It used to be a whole EA. And then under the McGuinty government, they came up with TPAPs so we could expedite building transit. And then on top of that, now the Ford government has made it even more expedited, where there's really, it's hard pressed to say that we're really involved in an EA or that there's any requirement to really listen to the community. And the study that our friends at Save Jimmy Simpson did really would have had traction if it was under the TPAP or under the TTC. So I just have to say, good job doing it. too bad that you had to take it on, but it's a seminal part of work. Of course, the original, well, not the original one went underground, you know where it went, down Pape and then down Carlaw and then through East Harbor and then under the river and then all the way downtown. However, once the Ford government got its hands on it and Metrolinks looked at it, they said, well, we own those tracks. We're already putting on a fourth line for GO expansion. Why don't we just put the tracks there? And hence it came above ground on the west side of the river and then came across and runs 2 kilometers up to Gerrard Square. Really and truly, it is a project that it's like walking through quicksand or soupy mud. You can never quite pin it down. You all know it was going to be tracks on both sides. And now we have tracks on one side. It was just going to add extra track for GO on the track bed. Now they have to move the tracks in order to fit the tracks on the other side. And they are going to be raising the bridges and the track bed by 5 feet.
Can we see the
Originally it said-
slide, Paula?
Oh, no, I don't see
Yeah.
the slide.
Yeah, you want to put the slide on, Noam? Yeah, perfect.
Oh, there it is there. Thank you.
Yes.
There's that slide. So we can kind of see those tracks now and going to East Harbor. And one of the things that made everybody cry was that, you know, the poor people going to East Harbor, they don't want to have to go 20 meters below ground. So it has to be at grade because nobody will go. Well, that's silly because around the world, we know there's so many underground subways that are 20, 40, 60, very deep below ground. So that's a bit of a red herring, shall we say. We can just see this going all the way up to Gerrard Square in the tracks going on the, I'll call it the riverside. They still haven't agreed to actually properly name the station. It is in Riverside, but they insist on calling it Leslieville because it's very good promo for them. It has that charm that they like to be able to say we're building a Leslieville station because they've actually grabbed the station that was in Leslieville and they've moved it down the street to Degrassi and in Riverside. So there we are with this project that started out underground, then came above ground and was on 2 sides of the tracks. Now it's on one side of the track. The entire GO train tracks have to be reconfigured. And all of the bridges on Eastern, on Queen, on Dundas, on Logan, on Carlaw, all have to be rebuilt. You can imagine what a incredibly terrible and devastating impact that's going to have on the construction of that in the neighborhood. And not to mention how intrusive it is to have that many trains every 45 seconds running through the community, right through people's backyards and through our beautiful park. And Save Jimmy Simpson is bringing that focus to why should it be above ground when we have a perfectly good alternative to run it below ground, coming out at East Harbor, going up close to the same route. There it is there, going up Pape, which is already done in an environmental assessment, getting up to Gerrard Square. That just makes a lot of sense, but apparently we are not into sense. The difference in cost is probably very negligible, getting to be negligible because of the tremendous amount of work. The redoing of 6 bridges is no small cost. And all of the moving of the tracks, all of the reconfiguration in order to satisfy their desire that they own the tracks and they will do what they want. I'll say one other thing that's just come to light, you know, every week we learn a little something new. And Metrolinks, through their Building Transit Faster Act, they have set themselves a 30-meter right-of-way along the tracks in which they have full control over. They've given themselves full control over every bit of property there, private property, city property, to do what they need to do to build this monstrosity. We all want transit. We had a great transit plan. We're all involved in it. And somehow it's called, we've gone off, let's just say it's gone off the rails. And thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm always interested in this issue and standing beside you in the community all along this line where they're not very good community partners. Thanks.
Okay, so I was asked to speak on why is it that the health impact assessment that you're about to hear summarized, why was it crowd-funded instead of government funded? And it won't be a surprise to those of you who've been following these issues that the answer to that is the same answer to the question, why don't we have an environmental assessment for this particular plan? And why don't we have a cost-benefit analysis of the different options? Because the Ontario line could be built in many different ways with slightly different alignments and above ground or over ground, whatever. And we just don't have that evidence. So we don't have evidence-based planning, or perhaps there is evidence somewhere in the bowels of Metrolinks, but it is not available to the public. And in a democratic society, citizens have to have access to the data on which government bases its decisions. So if we don't have the information, then it's not evidence-based planning in a democratic society. And I guess I'm the person to say something about this before we actually get to the HIA, because I've been researching urban governance and infrastructure governance, but especially for the last 10 years, I've made a particular study of the kinds of bodies that are publicly funded and set up by statute and have many public powers, such as expropriation, but are not government per se. So these would include all of the agencies, boards, and commissions, what are called in the US or special purpose authorities, urban development corporations, all of that. A lot of infrastructure is not done by municipalities, as in city council, or even the TTC, which is directly controlled by the city, but it's done by these agencies, boards, and commissions, which are supposed to be arm's length. And the original idea was that, oh, well, then you can have experts who are on these boards and they're deciding on things. And it's not so politicized, not like when you have, you know, city councilors just exercising their political judgment as to what will be good. But as we know, that's one theory, but it doesn't necessarily work. And certainly what we have seen in the province of Ontario, not just with the Ford government, but going back to the days of Dalton McGuinty, was the creation of special agencies that are publicly funded, but not only behave like private corporations, but are staffed by people who come from the for-profit private sector, and yet they're getting fabulous salaries and they get to pay their corporate lawyers to, you know, protect them against lawsuits and so on, like out of public funds. So they have sort of the best of both worlds. And the idea for something like Metrolinks, the original idea was not a bad one, because there was a lot of talk about metropolitan governance and how we didn't have an agency that could coordinate transit across Steeles Avenue and so on and so forth. And so because people are moving and working and going to school across municipal boundary lines, it made sense to think about regional transit. But there's different ways of doing it. In Greater Vancouver, there's an agency called TransLink, which does not only transit, but also bicycle paths that go across the 21 municipalities, including Vancouver. TransLink has a board like Metrolinks, but the board of TransLink has 7 appointees from the component municipalities and only 1 or at maximum 2 from the province. So it's very different, because municipalities coming together to plan transit is one thing, but the Henry VIII kind of model of government that we have at Queen's Park is a very different one. And as Paula mentioned, this isn't just Doug Ford, this goes back to previous Liberal governments. So it's a real problem when you have agencies, boards, and commissions that have their own boards. They're constituted as their own corporation. So Metrolinx is a non-share capital corporation that is wholly owned by the province of Ontario, and only the province names board members, and the board members all come from the private sector. I've checked them out, and they all come from senior management, mostly in finance, and one or two real estate and one or two rail, but private rail. So that's who runs Metrolinx. And as I said, it's the top-down model where the province imposes its structure and its priorities on municipalities. So the story of Metrolinx is really the story of what can go wrong when governments stop having ministries of public works, which is what we used to have until about 2003. We no longer have ministries of public works. What we have is Infrastructure Ontario, which is also its own corporation with its own board. And we have Metrolinx, which is also its own corporation with its own board. And they're doing everything. And so by having these agencies that are in a way arm's length, but in a way they're political patronage appointments, because the previous CEO of Metrolinx was Rob Pritchard, well-known Liberal, who was previously the CEO of the Torstar Corporation, a well-known Liberal outfit. So he resigned the day that Doug Ford was elected. And then the Ford government brought in Phil Verster, whose claim to fame was to have helped to run one of the notoriously terrible private rail corporations in the UK that were set up in the wake of the breakup of British Rail and the terrible type of privatization of rail that followed. So that was his, and even people who are in favor of privatization said that the UK way of doing things was the wrong way to privatize. So you can't find anybody to defend what happened in the UK, but then Phil Verster decides, oh, well, there's greener pastures in Ontario, and he gets himself named the CEO of Metrolink. So these agencies are supposed to be arm's length, they're supposed to be non-political, but really they're political in the worst way, in that there's no democratic accountability, not only not to the citizens, but even to the municipalities. And so we have a real question of democracy in this province. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Hello, everybody. And I will, so, okay, I'm hoping to see my first slide. Oh, there. Okay, I thought I would start by giving a bit of an introduction about HIAs, and to understand a bit of the context of HIAs and how they're done and how they're different from environmental impact assessments, and why sometimes and why they need to be done, and why oftentimes HIAs come with a different answer than EAs in terms of the recommended solutions. Environmental assessments are supposed to take into account economic, social, and environmental factors, the three pillars of sustainable development. And those are the same factors that are critical for health as well. However, environmental assessments do not take the next step to really examine the implications of these factors for health. And that's what the added layer that a health impact assessment does. And the other thing which is common practice with health impact assessment is that they emphasize the equity component of who is most adversely impacted by the project. Next slide. This HIA was a desktop HIA, as I call it. It used the existing literature and to qualitatively assess the potential impacts. So it is a qualitative assessment, and it was really constrained by the fact that there is no completed environmental assessment and no real assessment of alternative options. So doing my best with the little information that Metrolink has provided us. Next slide. We have seen this, and in my HIA, I compared two proposals. I compared this proposal of the Ontario line, which has a surface component between Gerrard and East Harbour, going through our neighbourhood. And next slide. And this proposal will see a huge increase in the number of trains that go along this rail corridor in our neighbourhood. As you can see, there's a real increase in GO trains that will occur, as well as a real increase in terms of trains from the Ontario line, which will make up nearly half or more than half of the trains that will travel in the corridor by the time the project is in full force. Next slide. And then I compared the proposal from Metrolink to the alternative proposal that the community came up with, which Paula Fletcher presented to you earlier. And so I looked at those two options and not variations. And there would be small differences among different alignments, but I think overall the conclusions are probably likely the same. Next slide. Okay, so what did I look at in the HIA? I looked at environmental factors and air quality, climate change impacts, noise and vibration, looked at green space impacts, impacts on community design, i.e. impacts on the physical structure of the community. I also considered impacts on access to certain services, transportation, recreation and leisure, as well as health and social services. Then I had a whole area focusing on social equity and looking at various vulnerable populations. And I also considered the impacts of gentrification, the social change that occurs in neighborhoods when you put in a new transit line. And in the gentrification section, I also talk about employment and the distribution of those health impacts. And finally, I touch briefly on the impacts during construction. Next slide. I won't go through each one of those individually, but I will come straight down and say these were my conclusions based on the evidence. The evidence suggests an underground alignment would have fewer negative impacts on health, because the underground option would cause less disturbance to the current urban fabric, would have less negative impact on green space. It would result in less exposure to noise and possibly also less exposure to vibration. Certainly it would have less impact on quality of spaces used for recreation and leisure, and would have fewer negative impacts on children, seniors, people living on low income, and people who do not speak either of the official languages. And as equally important is it likely would cause less disruption during construction. Next slide. I will highlight the aspects which were the most important in terms of health impact. And that one of them is the green space. while Metrolink talks about the fact that it will increase the amount of park space in the neighborhood with their proposal, in fact, it will be removing trees and therefore, in fact, impacting the green space that already exists. And the extra park space is, in fact, not new space. It's space that is already full of trees along the corridor. So, and why are trees important? Trees, we are finding more and more about health impacts of trees and the benefits of having trees. And the strongest evidence we have in terms of impacts of green space on health is a reduction in heart and lung disease. And we know very well from our own experiences for many people that just being in increased green space reduces stress, improves mental health. And we also know that people tend to enjoy being physically active in greener spaces. And green space will also reduce air pollution in a neighborhood. Green space is also extremely important in terms of impacts under climate change. They reduce the urban heat island effect because it helps cool a community down. The soft ground around green spaces absorb water from the rain, therefore lowers the risk of flooding. And large trees also act as carbon sinks. Next slide, please. And why should we be concerned about noise? One of the big challenges with noise is that the current regulations and the Ontario guidelines are actually not protective of health. So Metrolink says it will follow the guidelines from the Ontario province. However, those guidelines are not health protective. So even if they meet those guidelines, health is still impacted. Again, noise is one of these emerging issues. Until recently, noise was only considered, even by health people, as a nuisance. It has only really been in the last 20 years that the health evidence has become strong enough that we've been able to demonstrate that levels of noise that people are generally exposed to in urban areas in most cities, and Toronto as a whole is not more noisy than other cities. We are similar to other cities, but those levels of noise are known now to impact health. And noise impacts health in terms of, first of all, it can impact the way we think. It results in sleep disturbance. It can affect mental health, and that contributes to cardiovascular illness. So the other thing as well, which is the most sensitive part, is annoyance and sleep disturbances are linked to exposure to noise, and those annoyance and sleep disturbances are linked to health impacts. And that's where we are now having the causal factor about how can noise create cardiovascular disease. And now even newer evidence will suggest that noise is even associated with increased risk of diabetes, for example. So while Metrolink suggests that noise barriers will install, some of the residences would experience less noise in future compared to today. There are other residences where noise levels are expected to increase. And since noise levels in Toronto are higher than they need to be for health, we should not be allowing to increase noise in the city of Toronto. The other thing to remember is that noise levels, average noise levels, which Metrolink uses as a benchmark, are not necessarily the best predictor of annoyance and sleep disturbance, and therefore not the best predictor of health impacts either. Next slide, please. Then the other major impact people are concerned about is impacts of construction. And of course, through construction, we'll have lots of noise, air quality issues, traffic issues, and community disruption. And all the evidence that I have seen points clearly to the fact that when you build an overground transit, you tend to have much more issues with these 4 factors than if you build underground. And one aspect which is really critical is in community disruption is the impact on the viability of businesses. And if the businesses go under, and then you have displacement, and also most of the times the businesses that are the most at risk are the businesses that are sort of independent mom and pop shops, that they call them, oftentimes independent stores that provide services to minority populations, and therefore those are the populations that will be most affected as well. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, to repeat a bit of myself, while the Ontario line provides benefits to residents and businesses of Toronto, people who live near the proposed lines and stations benefit less from the line and experience more of the potential negative effects. And to reduce those potential negative effects is putting the line underground is the best solution. Next slide, I think it's the end. And then I do talk as well about equity. And here with the issue of equity is an issue that transcends the underground and the overground options. Both options, in both options, care has been taken into addressing equity issues. Benefits of transit investments are not equally shared. And the Riverside and Leslieville residents who are more likely to experience detrimental impacts and benefits less include people living on low income. The equity deserving groups include Indigenous peoples. And as I said, next, I think next. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Leon, as part of our health impact assessment that we worked with Ronald on, we held 2 consultations with local residents, including academics and health professionals. And participants expressed being most concerned with environmental and health impact from noise and vibration. And Metrolink has released some noise data as part of their early works report. So I'm going to share with you the latest info we have, contextualize that information, and point out what's wrong and what's missing from the reports. And full disclaimer, I'm not an acoustics expert, but I'm a local resident who's concerned about the lack of due diligence by Metrolink, and I have been methodically going through their data. Next slide, please. First and foremost, I will point out Metrolink is following protocols from 30 years ago, which clearly do not reflect the latest scientific understanding on noise and vibration and its impact on health. For instance, they use 16-hour average and 8-hour average noise, and people do not experience noise this way. So more on this later. But even using their out-of-date methodology, noise levels are projected to near or exceed 70 decibel in some parts of our neighborhood. At these levels, the CDC warns the prolonged exposure could lead to hearing loss. There is no mention of the word hearing loss anywhere in their reports. There is no mention of the word health anywhere in their reports. And under these antiquated protocols, they're only required to investigate mitigation. Metrolink is under no obligation to ensure noise levels are reduced to what's deemed to be safe. As long as they put up a noise wall, they're off the hook. The effectiveness of the noise wall is not their concern. Put another way, if you happen to live in one of these homes with excessive noise levels that it interferes with your daily activities like sleep, that's your problem, not Metrolink's. And I wish I were exaggerating. Next slide, please. This is what Metrolink told us this year. And the health impacts are discussed by occupational health agencies and experts, and it is not standard Metrolink's practice to conduct health impact assessment as a transit agency. Like I said, if there's a problem, it's yours, not Metrolink's. Next slide, please. Metrolink's provides noise data that's averaged over 16-hour and 8-hour periods. What we need to see is the maximum sound level, Lmax, as US Department of Transportation explains, quote, maximum sound level is important in judging the interference caused by a noise event. Metrolink does not provide this information at all. Why not? The protocol doesn't require them to. Next slide, please. The closest thing Metrolink does provide is the pass-by noise for the Ontario line, which comes to a 61 decibel on average, and it exceeds 70 decibel in some locations. Ontario line trains may be electrified and quieter than diesel trains. By no means are they silent. And 1,000 Ontario line trains passing by our neighborhood every single day will be disruptive to local residents. And what I find troubling is Metrolink refuses to provide pass-by noise for GO trains, VIA trains, and freight trains. And Metrolink also refuses to provide the data from the simultaneous pass-by from multiple trains. So the maximum noise values that account for the cumulative impacts from GO trains, VIA trains, freight trains, and Ontario line trains, we have no idea what they are. And why did they not provide this? Their protocol doesn't require them to do so. The protocol from 30 years ago. And this is, and next slide, please. And this is exactly what Health Canada criticized Metrolink for. They refuse to look at health risks as part of their assessment, and they refuse to study cumulative impacts from multiple projects. One of the federal funding conditions is thorough environmental review. And I have to ask you, does this look like Metrolink is meeting that condition? Now I want to talk to you about their projected noise data. No, don't move to the next slide. I want to set this up. We had misgivings about their noise data because they didn't measure current noise levels. They predicted them. And this is contrary to best practices by Canadian Transportation Agency, which recommends field measurements. So they're essentially comparing predicted current levels to predicted future levels. But there are more serious problems with their data. Next slide, please. This is the predicted noise levels without barrier at nighttime. Norm and I took this information from the early works report and we just put it on a map so we can visualize it. At 456 Carlaw, which is in the upper left corner, noise is expected to increase by 6 decibels. But at 14 Degrassi, which is much closer to the rail corridor, noise is expected to increase by only 1 decibel. A 3 decibel increase means doubling of sound energy. And decibel is on a logarithmic scale. A small change in decibel results in an enormous change in the amount of noise. And bear in mind, this data is averaged over 8-hour period. There should not be such wide variances like this, but there are. Why? And there are even more irregularities if we look at their daytime noise. Next slide, please. This is what Metrolink says the noise levels will be once they increase the train frequency tenfold, and there are 1,800 trains passing through every day without the noise barrier. Highlighted in green are places where Metrolink says noise will decrease. Look at 2 and 8 Paisley, highlighted in yellow. They are virtually next to each other, yet there's a sizable decrease at 2 Paisley, while there's meaningful increase at 8 Paisley. How? At the bottom left, let's start at the bottom left at the 31 Salter. The noise decreases by 6 decibel. And a few meters up at 791 Queen Street, noise increases by 3 decibels. Across the street at 14 Degrassi, noise decreases by 5 decibels. And up at 88 Wardell, noise increases by 3 decibels. And folks, I'm no sound expert, but I think I can comfortably say this looks highly improbable. And let me put this into context. If you look at their GO expansion studies, the average noise increase is 2.5 decibels within 40 meters of the rail corridor. And that's from GO expansion alone. So in our neighborhood, where they have GO expansion plus 1,000 Ontario line trains, they're saying noise is going to decrease. Something doesn't add up. The effectiveness of their noise wall also defies logic. Next slide, please. This shows noise reduction as a result of this 12-meter tall noise wall. At 14 Degrassi, it reduced noise by 3 decibels, but next door at 22 Degrassi, it's twice as more effective. It reduces by 7. The most striking example is at 2 Paisley, where almost no reduction is expected, but right next door at 8 Paisley, more than 10 decibel reduction. And to put that into context, 10 decibel is what is perceived to be twice as loud to the human ear. So at 8 Paisley, it's going to be twice as quiet as 2 Paisley. Does that make any sense to you? And this anomaly is best captured if we compare day and night. Next slide, please. So each location has 2 data points associated with it, the daytime noise reduction and nighttime noise reduction. Let's go back to 22 Degrassi, which offers about the same noise reduction between day and night, 7 decibels. But at 14 Degrassi, just a few meters south, it's much more effective at night than during the day. And these locations literally next to each other. And what could account for this type of discrepancy? At 881 Girard in the upper right corner, the wall offers twice as more noise reduction during the day, but at 398 Logan, a few meters south, the opposite is true, where it's 3 times more effective at night. And folks, this is what is in their early works report. This is Metrolink's data. This is their projected data. I'll just like to say, this is not just some numbers on paper. This data is used to justify an extremely disruptive project that, in my view, should have been tossed out at the EA stage. I think it is critical that we have some data integrity in what is presented to the public. But I will leave it to you to draw your own conclusions about what Metrolink is saying here. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about the operational phase of the Ontario line, but let's touch briefly about potential noise impact from construction. And Councillor Fletcher sort of alluded to this. In order to fit the disruptive above ground Ontario line, they need to make a lot of adjustments to the rail corridor. They need to lift up one of the in-use GO tracks and move it east in order to make room for the Ontario line. They got to raise the entire track bed by up to 1.6 meters and replace or build anew 6 bridges in our neighborhood. And because they're using the live rail corridor, they cannot stop GO trains for this construction, meaning much of this work lasting a decade will be happening mostly overnight, meters from people's bedrooms. This is going to be beyond disruptive, but as you saw earlier, Metrolink doesn't concern itself with thousands of people having sleep disturbance. It's not their problem, it's yours. And if we were to follow the hybrid route, there is no need for overnight construction for a decade. Next slide, please. So lastly, I want to speak to the process. Metrolink has been saying that the design for the Ontario line is already final, but the environmental impact assessment hasn't even been published yet. So on what basis did Metrolink design the Ontario line? It isn't to mitigate environmental impact, because we haven't seen them yet. It hasn't been released yet. And it's not to listen to the public. We haven't been consulted on anything, well, other than the color of the noise wall. So just what criteria was used for the Ontario line on all the substantive decisions, like where to put the stations and what kind of alignment to use, to whether to go above ground, underground. And I must ask, who else was in that room making these decisions that are being imposed on communities up and down Toronto? But the HI makes it clear the route Metrolink is pursuing, without the benefit of an environmental assessment, without any meaningful consultation with the public, compromises community health and well-being. It's shameful enough that our community had to crowdfund this HIA. It should have been done by the provincial agency. So now that we have put some facts and evidence on the table that Metrolinks and their political masters cannot dismiss, I'm curious to see how they respond. The ball is in their court now. Let's see how they respond. I would just say this, that no responsibly planned transit undermines public health. No public transit should compromise public health. Let's see how Metrolinks proceeds. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. And for now, I pass it over to Paul.
Thank you, Ian. Next slide, please. You may be wondering, I'm going to talk a little bit about the trees and open space. You may be wondering, why is Metrolinks planning to cut down trees inside the fencing and in lands beside the tracks, including parks? I hope I can shed some light on the immediate threat to the trees and the impact on our health. Next slide, please. Regarding Metrolinks and tree removals, Metrolinks says trees will be removed for widening of track beds and for the new electrification wires, although the timing of the electrification for GO is not known. Metrolinks policy states that trees will be removed if they are invasive, diseased, dead, or simply in the way. Metrolinks is completing an arborist report for early 2022, and I'll come back to the details of this in a moment. Next slide, please. As Ronald has already stated regarding the health impact assessment that was just done, green space and trees factor in a big way. Intuitively, we know trees are important, but this is much more than just a gut feeling. As Ronald mentioned, there is strong evidence linking trees and parks to health. Trees and parks are important for everyone, but most important for people who have no access to a yard. People living in apartments, including people on lower incomes, many of whom are seniors. Next. The overground Ontario Line option removes most of the existing tree canopy along the rail corridor. What you see in the background here will be removed. And that will have a negative impact on people's health. The underground option has lower health impacts, and for that reason is the preferred design. Next. Why nature matters to health. There's been an extensive review of scientific evidence recently done by Toronto Public Health, looking at the links between green space and health. And this is referenced in the health impact assessment if anyone would like to dig into it in any more detail. But you can see along the top all the different factors, including mental health, physical activity, well-being. These are all tied to green space and trees nearby. Next slide. This is a little more detail from that study. The top green space features that positively influence health include trees, plants, and having green space nearby. Next slide. So these are very relevant to the project before us today. Next slide. So you may be wondering, why exactly are the trees in danger? I'll explain the Metrolinks proposal for track widening and the resulting impact on trees. Next. This is the existing line looking down. Jimmy Simpson building is on the right. Notice the space in between the first track and the second track. It's just green there on the image. Metrolinks is planning to add one GO line and 2 Ontario lines to this existing track arrangement. Adding 3 more train lines would require extensive widening of the existing track bed. Next slide. You can see that in this illustration, we've added 3 green GO lines. Those are the existing trains. We know GO expansion is underway. The 3 green trains are existing, as I mentioned. Metrolinx is planning to add a 4th GO line, which is shown in yellow. This shows how a 4th track fits without widening the existing rail bed. In fact, south of Queen Street, there are already 4 tracks in place. You can see that on Google Maps. If it were electrified, you can see the extent of tree removals. This is Metrolinx's policy to remove the trees 7 meters from the center line of the track. So some trees would be removed within the fence line, but it doesn't impact the trees on the park sides. If it were electrified, you can see the extent of the tree removals. This is not Metrolinx's plan. I'll show you their plan in a moment. They want to add 2 more lines for the Ontario line. Next slide. So looking at this in cross section, this is looking north. You would have Jimmy Simpson Park on the right and Bruce Mackey Park on the left. It shows what's there today. Note the trees inside the Metrolinx property lines, those dashed black lines are property lines. Trees inside the property lines are lighter green, and the fall colored trees are in the parks and lands adjacent to the fence line. Next slide. Adding the 4th GO line. This is the same view with the 4th GO line added. Note, there's no track bed widening needed, and trees may not need to be removed, depending on the electrification poles, wire locations, and when in fact they would be electrified. We still don't know that. This is not what Metrolinx is currently planning. Next slide. This is what Metrolinx is planning. You can see the 3 existing trains in a ghost image lower on the lower level. You see the note saying on the bottom saying existing GO tracks. Those would be relocated. The non-ghosted trains shown higher up show 1 additional GO line on the right side and the 2 added Ontario lines on the left for 6 trains in total. Note the new retaining walls on each side, those gray kind of bars. That's to allow Metrolinx to raise the entire track bed up 1.5 meters. Next slide. So we've just enhanced the trains. This is the same drawing showing the 3 GO lines in green, the additional GO line in yellow, and the 2 Ontario lines in red. And then you can see the trees ghosted in behind. Those are the existing trees. And you can see where the trees are in the way of the new retaining wall construction and the conflicting overhead wires. Next slide. So adding the 4th GO line and the Ontario line, this shows the estimated extent of tree removals in the orange zone due to the wires and the retaining wall construction. So basically all the trees within the fence line and the trees along the edges of the fence line in the parks. Next slide, please. So in the immediate future, Metrolinx removal plans, this is information from the Community Advisory Committee. It's the official community advisory group on the GO expansion project. And I'm quoting, "We understand the only trees being removed this year are inside the right-of-way along Gerrard from Carlaw to Pape." So that would be behind the LCBO and the No Frills store. Metrolinx's plan is the rest of the trees from Eastern all the way up to Gerrard, both inside and outside the right-of-way, will be cleared January, February of 2022, so in a few months. We expect more specific details soon. So that's what the report is from the Community Advisory Committee. I should add that from the Save Jimmy Simpson Group perspective, in March of this year, Metrolinx promised in writing that no vegetation would be removed until the summer of 2022, many months later. This seems to have changed. These changes simply undermine Metrolinx's credibility. They undermine it and illustrate the difficulty Metrolinx seems to be having with internal communications and sound project management processes. Next slide, please. So Metrolinx's policy, they have a vegetation guideline. On the left is a recent tweet from Metrolinx. It shows what's happening in other locations. They've basically cut the trees down. These look like fairly mature trees. probably 20, 30 years old, turned them into firewood. And then in return, they've planted these tiny saplings in a location that, you know, we don't really know. They don't go in the same location they were removed from typically. So obviously not supportive of health of wildlife or people. Next slide, please. Just wanted to talk about the ecological function of the existing corridor. It's a complex ecology. People don't go in there, pets don't go in there. So there's a lot of shelter and food for birds and insects, all sorts of wildlife. And animals rely on invasives as much as they rely on native trees. Health doesn't distinguish between native and non-native species. Next slide. So these are just some examples of the trees that are in immediate danger of being cut down. All the trees you see in this image in the foreground. Next slide. These are some maps from the health impact assessment. This one shows the average tree canopy in the city of Toronto and the arrow pointing to the study location. So you can see the area immediately around the track, this project, Riverside and Leslieville, 7 to 18% tree canopy coverage, and the city has a target of 40%, so well below the city's target. Next slide, please. And this is park area per person in Toronto, so how much park space does each person get? And again, it's very low in the study area, one of the lowest. Next slide, please. And the area of parkland need in Toronto. So this is looking at anticipating future growth and what will be needed. And again, this area comes up as an area of parkland need. These are studies that were done by the City of Toronto. Next slide, please. Jimmy Simpson Park is located in the middle of the upper of the image. And this slide is looking over Carlaw. According to the city's parkland strategy, South Riverdale will need more parklands as intensification continues. And you can see all the apartment buildings on Queen, Broadview, Carlaw, and Gerrard. Next slide, please. Here are before and after drawings to illustrate what the parks will look like. In this case, it's looking at Bruce Mackey Park, and technically it should have a large above ground station in the bottom image. In addition, just at the very end of that wall. Next slide, please. And this is a view into Jimmy Simpson Park. Again, you can see the removal of the trees and the addition of the retaining wall and the noise barrier wall. Next slide, please. So for more information and to stay tuned, please check out the new website, savejimmysimpson.ca. Next slide. And I believe there's an email address that will be coming up later on in the talk. At this point, I'll turn it over to MPP Peter Tabuns.
Thanks very much, Paul. And well, hey, that was quite a presentation. I really appreciate it. All of you who are present this evening know we've had a really rocky 3.5 years since Doug Ford was elected premier. And I'm not even counting COVID in that. A lot happened under the cover of COVID and a lot happened before COVID struck. And the Ontario line, as designed, and the above ground section are part of that rocky period. Everyone is familiar, and Councillor Fletcher went over this at the beginning. We had a viable transit project proposed for and accepted by this community in 2018. One, frankly, that even under Metrolink's own plans recognizes that it would be under construction at this point. We would be well on our way to providing an opportunity for people to get downtown without going to Bloor Yonge Station. And that whole project was discarded by the Ford government. We know in this community that there is a very clear need for transit, and it's not something that is simply a a nice thing to say. The reality is that constituents, people who live in the Riverside area, in the Leslieville area, who live in Riverdale, who live along the Danforth, know on a daily basis that to get to work, to get around, they are stuck in situations of overcrowding time and time again. And granted, with the pandemic on, that has been reduced. But as more and more people are vaccinated, as public health measures have their impacts, and as more and more employers require people to return to work, we know the conditions that we're going to encounter on streetcars, subways, and buses throughout this community and throughout the center of Toronto. We know that with population growth, and frankly, we know that because we had people over the capacity of the subway system before the pandemic, that we are going to need a transit line running parallel to Yonge, east of the Don River, in the years to come. And it doesn't matter what it's called, we know what we need. And the challenge for us in this community, and the challenge for Toronto as a whole, is to get that right. To do it in a way that is compatible with the communities already in place, and to make sure that it gets done on an expeditious basis, gets done well on a cost-effective basis. And I think everyone who's here would agree that those criteria are not necessarily hallmarks of the Ford administration. My colleague, Councillor Fletcher, talked about the ongoing shifting plans with Metrolinks and the difficulties that that has presented, and the fact that when substantial changes are proposed and brought forward, we're told that they have no impact on cost at all, but we are not given the numbers. And I suspect that all of you are like me. When people are not willing to give me the numbers and show in concrete terms what's going on, my suspicions are aroused, to say the least. Professor Valverde talked, I think, very effectively about the authoritarian and autocratic approach that the Ford government has taken to the planning and the implementation of the Ontario line. Mr. Macfarlane, you did a very good job, I think, in presenting the evidence before us. And it should not be the role of the community to actually set up a GoFundMe account and go out and do their own health impact assessment. Glad that we did, glad that there was leadership in the community to do it, but it should simply have been a normal part of doing business. Ian Song did a very good critique of the sound planning, the sound and acoustic and vibration presentations made by Metrolinks, raising profound questions about their reliability and the impact of this project on us. And Paul Young, I would say that your presentation on green space and the impact of the expanded 6 rail line configuration was one of the clearest expositions I've seen of the problem that we're facing, and it's a substantial one. This community has not been quiet. It has not been passive. It is engaged in demonstrations to the extent allowable in COVID, but certainly it's been alive on social media. It's been alive at the legislature in presentations to committee when the bills relevant to Metrolinks have shown up. And that level of activity and level of activity and simply making noise was noticed. I think that the investments that Metrolinks made in Instagram influencers, in doing literature drops on the web, all speak to the fact that this community has had an impact. It has been noticed, and Metrolinks has understood that they have a public relations problem here. At the very beginning of this whole process, and I think, Maggie, you can speak to this as well as anyone, Metrolinks would not assure the community that the Jimmy Simpson Center was going to be left untouched. Now, recently I've been told, oh no, it was never in danger. But I want to say to all of you, the noise that was made and the organizing that went on was critical to ensuring that at least at this point, the claim is, and the plans may well bear it out, that the Jimmy Simpson Center will not in fact be demolished. I don't think that that was clear at the beginning. And I think it was organizing that forced that position, that said to Metrolinx, here is a line you cannot cross. I have to say that they also felt the heat around the parks, notwithstanding the visual presentations that you made, Paul Young, and as grim as they are, the reality is that there may not be actual encroachment on the space, even though there is encroachment on the greenery. But I think Metrolinx understood that this again was a flashpoint. Now, the Ontario line expands outside of the Metrolinx zone corridor at the Gerrard and Logan station and down at Queen and Degrassi, something that was not highlighted in any presentation made by Metrolinx. But again, it was the organizing in the community that established the parks as flashpoints and ones that Metrolinx had to avoid. I want to just say in the end, this community has organized, made noise, and Metrolinx has had to respond. And I think that the health impact assessment just presented this evening is a sign that this is a community that does not just simply whine or make stuff up. It actually is willing to invest and present hard evidence based on sound research. That's taken us some distance, but there's still a lot further to go. This is a very tough time. We have been engaged with a government that is not responsive in a downtown Toronto riding or even a series of downtown Toronto ridings. And so I say to you that we have to broaden the struggle that we're engaged in and bring in another set of issues. Councillor Fletcher may address this when we get into questions, but we know that Metrolinx historically has been a highly politicized bureaucracy. At the beginning of the 2000s was a regional transit planning body with representatives from all of the local municipalities. And around 2008, 2009, then Dalton McGuinty, Premier, got rid of that and effectively put Metrolinx under the wing of the Minister of Transportation. And we know that with former Minister of Transportation, Steve Del Duca, that Metrolinx threw out its planning studies showing that a station in Minister Del Duca's riding was not justifiable when he simply announced that there would be a station there. They rewrote their evidence, according to Ontario's Auditor General. We had order-based evidence rather than planning based on real information. I think what we see with the Ontario line in the months to come, with the substantial powers that the Ontario Cabinet gave itself in the Building Transit Faster Act, is the potential for development really far outside the parameters set by the City of Toronto. Development that will be fueled by and abated by the Ford government. We know that they have been entirely willing to use ministerial zoning powers to go far outside city zoning plans, to ignore provincial wetland restrictions, and to simply say construction and development will go here, this is the form it will take, and cities, you're just going to have to live with it. I think that that is going to be something that we are going to have to focus on in the next while. I think the case has already been made as to why, in terms of health and planning, it makes more sense to go underground in the south end of the Toronto Danforth community. But I would say that that is an argument that's far more appealing to those in the community and immediate neighbors. In order to actually have an impact on provincial politics, we're going to have to, I think, illustrate that this process overall is far more politically driven rather than planning driven. And I think that's a discussion that is going to have to be held in our community. How do we broaden this fight so that it has a larger impact on the credibility of this government in the way it does transit planning, so that we can open a space for consideration of the options that make far more sense for our community. I know I'm running a bit long here. I just want to thank Safe Jimmy Simpson and everyone this evening who's taken part in this webinar for the work that you've done. There's an old reality in political life and that's that no fight is certain, but if you don't fight, you will certainly lose. And I think we're in a position now where we have to fight, because otherwise the losses are ones that we will not want to bear. And with that, I turn it back to Maggie. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Peter. We have a little bit of time left for some Q&A. And so I'm going to ask Laura, who's been looking at the questions, to tell us what the first question are, and if it's first question is, and if it's not already directed, I'm happy to direct it unless you want to.
Hi, Maggie. I actually don't have any open questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, now is the time.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think
It's Paula with the very little battery, but I just really like to see that slide again with the number of trains. It was such an incredible visual going from, I forget how many it was, to 1,500, 157 to 1,500. It was very powerful.
Oh, the one in Ronald's.
Yes.
It was in Ronald's.
If anybody had that.
Yeah, it's there. It's in the HIA too.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. Oh, there it is right there.
There it is. Yeah.
Just to go over the numbers, currently there's 169. The goal is increasing from 169 to 536. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then the Ontario line 912 are brand new. And the others, are we counting those as the via and the freight?
That's correct, yes.
And they're existing currently. So are they currently there?
Yeah, as far as I know, they currently are there, yes.
Okay, and these numbers came out of, I can't see this here. They came out, just tell me the source again, is it Metrolink?
Steve Monroe got them out of the various reports from Metrolinks.
Okay,
And combined them into one chart.
I see. This is it's very effective, and we know Steve is a very good researcher. Thank you very much for going over that.
And I would add here, Paula, that there's even some question. I know Steve had to work, he said he had to work very hard to get these numbers, and he's written a whole piece on it that's linked, there's mentioned there. But there's also, he also, I believe, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, then thought that as he looked further, that actually it's even a higher number of trains, and sometimes the figure people are bandying about is 1,800. That when it was very hard, he said, to find these figures. It's a bit like the noise and vibration. If you saw the initial information, it was like impossible to read unless you were some kind of expert. Anyway, he dug through these. He thinks, I understand, he thinks it's even higher now.
We have some questions.
The numbers came from the early works report what Steve's citing. The noise and vibration data, they actually went to projections to 2060. When you get there, the number actually increases to 1,800 trains. So just that point.
Okay, another question, Laura,
Yes, we have questions related to what are the next steps to take the HIA to the media, as well as the information provided by Eon about the noise discrepancies?
So I will say the HIA report has gone to the media. There was CBC gave it quite good coverage. We did do a media release at Queen's Park last week, although it was the same day that the $15 increase, the increase in the minimum wage to $15 was announced. So the interest was somewhat limited, but we did release it, and we are still trying to circulate it to various places. And Eon, why don't you talk about what has been done to date with the noise and vibration, or the noise info? It was submitted to Metrolinks, right?
Yeah, so we the problem is we asked questions to Metrolinks to clarify some of their methodologies on October 4th. They didn't respond to us till October 20th, which effectively gave us 4 days to review their early works report, which is just not possible. I mean, they released 2 different early works reports on the same day, and together they account for 3,000 pages of dense technical material, which simply didn't have time for. So unfortunately, we only were able to review the noise and vibration section, and we submitted a response to that. I have talked to a few people about some of these discrepancies, and a few people thought it were very interesting, but I don't really know how we can, I mean, I'm thinking about what we can do to sort of get other community groups maybe interested, because I think there may be other folks who are sort of receiving same kind of flawed data. So maybe as MPP Peter Tabuns suggested, to sort of broaden this fight and try to find some clues that sort of resonate with a lot of different community groups and try to make a lot of noise around it. That's what we're hoping to do. And I suspect people like Ombudsman's office or the person who's approving all of this noise data at the Ministry of Environment might be interested to hear about this kind of stuff too. So we will make outreach to them to make sure they understand that our reservations about this data and see if anything can be done about that.
And can you speak a little bit about the presentation of the HIA to the city and how the city can respond, as well as the Chief Medical Officer of Health?
Well, I will say we're meeting with Mayor Tory's Chief of Staff later this week, and we have sent them a copy of the HIA. And we've been sending them slowly. It's a lot of work for a small group of volunteers, but bit by bit, we sent them to several people in the NDP caucus, and we're going to be sending them to other caucus members as soon as we can get them out there. It takes time to do all this stuff. And we're meeting with MP Julie DeBrusen also later this week, and she also has received a copy of it. So,
and similar, Maggie, can we speak to how it was presented to Metrolinks and if they have responded as yet?
We sent it to Metrolinks as part of our early works response, or our response to their early works report, and we have no idea if they've even looked at it yet. I'm sure they're aware of this webinar. I'm sure they've been listening in. I'm sure we'll get a response now. And if not, we'll try again.
Okay. A couple of questions related to, well, is it possible to leverage an inquest into having Metrolinks restate their original budget? There's been so much change to the original plan, and yet they continue to state $800 million savings.
You want to speak to that, Peter?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I think the first thing to say is that I've asked them for their numbers on their new plans, and they will not release those numbers. The ability to get at them on this is relatively low. I don't think there could be an inquest, but certainly I think it's worth asking the Auditor General to do that. I don't know if SGS would like to do that, and I would be happy to boost that with the Auditor General, because I just find that I find the lack of transparency profoundly troubling. If you're open about what your things cost, about your identified savings, then you induce trust in people. When you cover it up, that doesn't help at all. I've had people argue to me at the Metrolinks end, well, if they give out the numbers, then any future bids will be compromised because bidders will know how much is being budgeted. Councillor Fletcher can talk to this, but the city all the time announces what it budgets for particular projects, and they get competitive bids. When I was a councillor, we got competitive bids, even though we announced budgets. I just think it's a bunch of hot air, frankly.
Remember, the original underground relief line was $8 billion. We knew that the amount.
Yeah,
It was
I
always-
know.
You're
Lori, you're
muted.
muted.
Sorry, thank you. Related to that, is there any other legal recourse that the community may have?
If I could just say, I don't think anyone on this panel has the legal training to say with certainty. So I would say someone has to talk to a lawyer. But the way that Ford has reshaped the law, my sense is that no, there is not a legal recourse. I've found it quite extraordinary the last few years to see how new laws have been written in ways that explicitly protect the government of Ontario from any legal action, including for acts of negligence. It's quite extraordinary and unprecedented in my experience.
Do you want to add to that, Mariana?
Yeah, so yes, Peter is absolutely right, because what the Ford government has done is manipulate the first past the post structure of Ontario elections, so that even though they got in as a majority government with what, somewhat under 40% of the vote or something of the sort, well, but then they gave themselves power as if they were the government of China. So like the notices that, you know, people like me and Eon, and I don't know about Paul, maybe you're a little further from the actual track, but the notices that we got in our mailbox saying that there was a condition placed on our property title in the provincial land registry that we couldn't, you know, build a shed in our yard without permission from Metrolink. I mean, that was astounding. Like, you know, our Chinese friend says that's the sort of thing that happens in China. So the law is like of no help here. The only thing that is of help is public opinion, and insofar as going to the Auditor General is useful, it's because the press pay a lot of attention to what the Auditor General says. Although really the Auditor General already did a very critical study of the public-private partnership model that Infrastructure Ontario has, and in particular, their method of financing. And she proved that actually we were wasting a lot of money because private financing, guess what, is more expensive than public financing, because the government of Ontario can borrow money cheaper than the private companies. And that didn't have any effect. And in fact, Infrastructure Ontario has changed their public-private partnership model in the direction of giving even more money and power to the private sector. So even going to the Auditor General is not necessarily going to work when you have a government that doesn't listen to anybody. Even the Auditor General, who is usually seen as objective, and you know, she's an accountant and she hated the Liberals clearly. So, you know, you would think that the Ford government would listen to her, but they don't. So I think agitation, like the sort of thing that Peter was referring to, like make enough noise, you know, have a demonstration at Queen's Park and then get an op-ed in the newspaper and whatnot. And then try to connect the issues, which I think Peter was also, you know, referring to, because there is a real problem with governance in this province having become a dictatorship instead of a democracy. And I don't think there's enough people riled up about that, including at City Hall, because John Tory should be screaming bloody murder that the city's powers and the city's plans are being thrown under the bus or out the window because Doug Ford doesn't like it. And because laws have deprived municipalities of a lot of their traditional powers. And so, you know, like how Metrolinx works, as opposed to what I explained at the beginning, you know, in Greater Vancouver, they have TransLink, which is regional transit, but the municipalities control it, which isn't always great, you know, because the suburban municipalities are more numerous than the more urban ones, but still, at least it's some kind of, you know, democracy. But what we have in this province is the absence of democracy and a de facto dictatorship. And I don't think people are taking it seriously enough. And that to me is sort of what we should be agitating about. And that's what links all of these different struggles, whether it's the planning of the Ontario line or the ministerial zoning orders or this stupid 413 highway that the Ford government wants to build, even though even the 905 municipalities are voting against it. So the whole problem of sort of the loss of democracy is, you know, to my mind, the overarching issue. And, you know, the Liberals probably won't make such a fuss about it in the election because they benefited from the way that the jurisprudence and the courts have evolved to favor, you know, provincial sovereignty. But, you know, that's what I think is really going on. And so there's a lot more than just the Ontario line and the trees that might be uprooted at Jimmy Simpson Park across the street from my house. Although with some people, you have to kind of talk to them about the trees in front of their house. That's what will get them, you know, riled up. But in the end, it's about the fate of democracy in this province.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to stop now, Mariana, just because we're just past 8:30. I don't know, can we stick around for a few more minutes if people want to hear more answers to more questions? Can we do that, meeting host? Well, I'm going to assume we can because we haven't been cut off yet. Okay, so we'll spend just a few more minutes, maybe 5 minutes. Do you want to ask another question, Laura?
Yeah, I think the last area of questions, which is in a few of the questions, is related to the federal funding. And can this HIA impact the federal government and their funding?
Well, it's certainly an area we at Save Jimmy Simpson have been trying to harp on anyway, is that there are federal funding conditions for the $10 billion that are being given to the transit infrastructure plans. And I think the Ontario line is getting $4 billion of that, if I'm not mistaken. But, you know, the thing is that these conditions came out well after the project was underway. And the fact that they haven't met these conditions so far, we haven't gotten any real response to our pushing on that. But we are meeting with MP Julie DeBrusen later this week. So we can hope we can bring that up with her again and hope that she can exercise some influence in trying to see that these funding conditions are met. I mean, it's a bit late in the game, but you know, ideally they should be more than just words on paper, which is what they are in terms of what's going on in Toronto. Anyway, that's what they are now, just words on paper. Anybody else want to speak to this?
I mean, I do think it's quite significant, especially because it seems like, I mean, we haven't talked to a lawyer about any legal options, and it's something I think that might be just worthwhile pursuing, just to see if there are any options. Yeah, I know, but I mean, we're not a poor neighborhood by any stretch. I mean, we made this health impact assessment happen. If something, you know, I don't know what the funds might be required for something like that, but I think it is something that should remain on the table. To safeguard neighborhood safety. I mean, because the Ford government doesn't care about this NDP liberal voting writing. And if it comes down to it, I mean, some of the stuff shenanigans that's going on, especially with the environmental assessment, I would think there is at least ways we can delay, proceeding of the project. And bear in mind, there has been no contracts awarded to anybody. No significant amount of construction has begun anywhere along the route. If there's a time to change this, I do think it's now and the next couple of months. And I think we need all hands on deck. If neighbors have any expertise in something they can help us with, if they're lawyers or advertisers, whatever the case might be, reach out to us. We really need everybody to be on their ball and make sure we're all advocating for our community in this. But I do think the federal funding condition is an interesting one, and we are working with other community groups that are similarly impacted by the unilateral decision making by Metrolinks with no proper assessment, no consultation. The same story, and we are actually meeting with them tomorrow to figure out our strategy and such. So that is in the works, and we'll see if we can make something happen on that front.
One last question, Laura. Is there one last one, do you think?
I think we've done all of them.
Oh, well, very good. And just in my extra 5 minutes. So firstly, I want to thank everyone on the panel and everybody who helped get this organized and those who helped facilitate this evening in one way or another. I'd like to thank them very much. And I also want to remind people, do you want to show the last slide, please, Noam? Remind people that they can support Save Jimmy Simpson by signing up to our new webpage, by subscribing to our newsletter, by responding to our calls to action, which we put out every so often. When we think, okay, it'll be good if people can write letters here or phone people here. So by all means, here's our website and our email. And then I'd also like to both thank and encourage people who are interested to get in touch with the Lakeshore East Community Advisory Committee. As somebody noted in their presentation, they've been around for quite a while and have they're the group that actually meets with Metrolinks and tries to push them on different issues, as difficult a job as that is. And they've certainly been germane to supporting a lot of the work that we do in the neighborhood as well. So that being said, so there's their contact information. Yes, so, and this session has been recorded and we will be posting it on our new website, I hope, in the near future anyway, and circulating a link around to people who should be seeing it too. So thank you very much, everybody, and good night.